On occasion, a young couple, or sometimes an older couple, who wants to get married comes to me and wants me to officiate the ceremony. And one of the things that I ask is that they'll meet with me they'll read a book together and they'll meet with me for premarital counseling. I don't charge them for it or anything, but it's an opportunity to have structured discussion about some of the practical ways that they can think about preparing for success in marriage. Because when people get married, especially those who are young, who maybe haven't been married before. Sometimes later in life, people are widowed or divorced, or for some other reason are coming to marriage again. But especially for young people who are coming together to get married, oftentimes there's a sense, they have the feeling that their love is so strong for one another that it's unimaginable that things could ever be different for them. And yet, you don't have to dig too deep in terms of the statistics to see that many marriages don't make it. Many of those people who think that they're going to be together till death do they part, they don't make it that far. And so I'll often ask them, how are you going to divorce-proof your marriage? What are you going to do to that end? Now, there's all kinds of philosophies where people could say, this is how you do it. A popular one, and I'm not going to comment on it, but you've probably all heard it, is happy wife, happy life, right? But there are other views of this have shifted over time. Cultures change, expectations change. One of the things that used to be traditional in marriage vows and is no longer is the pledge that wives have often made, and maybe you've been to a wedding where this happened, where the bride, as part of her wedding vows, vowed to obey the groom. Now, for the record, this did not happen when Jess and I were getting married. Just let me just clear that up. But maybe you've been to a wedding where that happened. Maybe it was your own wedding. And let's take another angle of thinking about marriage. You may have also heard someone say, the husband is the head of the household. Now, we should ask there, what does the person mean by head, right? It's a metaphor. It's not transparent. We might think it is. Sometimes when they say the husband is the head of the household, maybe what they mean is he's the boss. He gets to make the decisions. Or he's the leader. He sets the direction for the family. Now, maybe they also mean, because it would be the flip side of the same coin, that he's the one who's responsible. If something goes wrong, point the finger at him, right? Now, where do these ideas come from? Because this way of viewing marriage, the husband is the head of the household, the wife with a call to obey, sometimes this has been seen as the Christian perspective. And it's not surprising in a way, because there are New Testament texts that people might point to that are kind of the background for some of this language. For instance, in 1 Peter 3, verse 6, and it said, she obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. And then in Ephesians 5, the passage we're going to be looking at today, there's also the phrase, the husband is the head of the wife, right? So where do these things come from in historically Christian culture? Well, I have to say, some of it comes from the Bible. So how do we make sense of it? How do we understand what it means for our own time? Well, the first thing to think about is how it would have been heard and received by the first people who heard it. Because their culture was very different from ours. The expectations of husbands and wives in that culture was very different than the average expectations in our culture today. So what would have stood out to them in what the Bible is saying about these things? That's an important question to ask. And the second thing is then, how do we translate that into our own time and our own culture? These are important questions to ask, because oftentimes when we read passages that speak in ways that we're not used to, or that seem inflammatory in our culture, it's easy to rush to judgment. And I think it's important, especially when we found the Bible trustworthy in so many ways in its guidance for our lives, to ask, what's really going on here? What's being said? How does it work? How do we put it into practice? And one of the things I think is often missed in dealing with this passage is that oftentimes we'll start reading in verse 22. And we'll see verse 22 is the one that catches a lot of people. But verse 21 is actually part of the same passage. Verse 21 says, "Be subject to one another out of..." This verse, it can go with the verses before, it can go with the verses after. It's actually kind of the middle of a continuous passage. There's no clean breaks. So when we talked about last week being filled with the Spirit, resulting in giving God praise, giving God thanks, singing to God, this flows right out of that. One of the consequences of being filled with the Spirit is that we are called to submit to one another, to be subject to one another. Why? Out of reverence to Christ. Now, the word behind reverence here is fear. You might remember in the Old Testament the phrase, "the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." It doesn't, like there, this means at least respect and not terror, but something sort of in between. It means taking seriously our relationship with Jesus such that we want to do what he calls us to do. And so the call here is for everyone in the church to submit to one another, to be subject to one another. And we might ask, well, what does that even look like? We might think of scenarios where a husband and a wife are trying to decide where to go out to eat. And one of them's like, "I don't care, you pick." And the other one's like, "I don't care, you pick." And they really do both care, maybe, but they don't want to be the one who makes the decision and makes the other one unhappy and not get their way. So they just go back and forth like the vultures in a Jungle Book. You remember that? You ever watch that? "I don't know, what do you want to do?" That's not what this is talking about, right? There is a place in mutual submission for you to express yourself as a person, to say, "This is how I feel, this is what I want," but still make space for the other person so that you can work through the decision together, offering one another love and respect in the way that you come to a decision. But some of the way that this is shaped is based on what's normal in given cultures. And so what we're going to see as we look ahead in everyone, and this would include both the wife and the husband, are called to submit to one another. In that culture, that would generally look different than maybe it would in our culture. It would also the way that Paul is talking about it is something that was unprecedented. There are ways that what he says would have fit right in with what people expected, and there are ways that completely break the bounds of the way people thought about these things. So first, let's start with the controversial part. It's next. "Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, the body of which he is the Savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands." Well, there's a few things that we should notice about this passage. One is that if you were to read because it was common in ethical instruction in that time, it was common for people to write about how husbands and wives were to relate to one another. And Paul's instruction for wives to submit to their husbands, this fits right in with cultural expectations of the time. This wouldn't have bothered anybody, probably. I mean, maybe a few people, but generally speaking, this would have been seen as normal, and to say otherwise would have seemed like anarchy. Like if you were overturning the normal social structure, that how is this going to work at all? However, Paul addresses the wives directly. It would have been fairly common in Greco-Roman ethical advice to address the husband and tell him how to manage his household. But Paul doesn't do that, and we'll see that shifts the way that this works a little bit. Paul also is going to transform the expectations of what this means and what this looks like, and this will be especially evident in the way that he addresses husbands. One of the things to mention is because he's not telling husbands how to manage their households, he does not tell husbands to make their wives submit. In fact, there's no grounds anywhere in the New Testament, anywhere in the Bible, for a husband telling a wife to submit. That is not what Paul says. In fact, the phrase submit or be subject, it's actually softer in its force than some of the instructions to husband. It's actually not in the form of, grammatically, it's actually not even in the form of a command. Although the content in translation is accurate, that's the meaning, the force is not as strong as some of what Paul will say a little later. One of the other things to notice about this is that Paul offers a model of this. He offers an analogy. And the analogy he offers is the relationship of the church to Jesus Christ. But notice, we often talk about Christ as Savior and Lord. And notice the emphasis here on Christ as Savior, right? The church is submitting to the one who has rescued us, the one who has saved us, and who has done so sacrificially. Back in chapter 2, and we'll see that Paul links this. He's going to talk in the same way in just a minute. He talks about the way that Christ has saved us as loving us and giving himself up for us. So the idea of submission here is of one submitting to someone who is pouring out their life for that person. And as we'll see, this was a dramatic reversal of the way that was often viewed in this culture. So the term head, it can mean leader. That's a pretty common meaning when it's used as a metaphor. It can also mean sword. In later culture, when this analogy was used for a group of people, a head and a body, like think of the phrase head of state. That would not have been, they wouldn't have used that phrase exactly, but that idea would have been familiar in the ancient world, that, like, say, the emperor is the head of the Roman Empire. But what's different here is that when that analogy was used, it would have been expected that the body would sacrifice itself for the sake of the head. And Paul turns that on its head. And he says, instead, the head is supposed to give itself up for the body. Why? Because that's what Jesus did. And so he says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So we see that echo of verse 2 here in verse 25. So this advice for husbands to love their wives, that also wouldn't have been out of place. It was pretty common for ancient moralists to celebrate marriages in which there was mutual love, but not in this way. There's an interesting passage in Pliny the Younger, who is from early 2nd century, a few decades after this, where he talks about the great relationship he has with his wife and how much that she loves him. But a lot of the focus of the passage is on how she loves to celebrate his triumphs. That the mark of a good marriage, in Pliny's view, is that the wife elevates the husband's honor. Notice that's not what Paul is talking about. Paul is talking about something very different. The husband's actions are oriented not toward himself, but toward his wife. In order, and this is talking about Jesus here, but we'll see what the analogy is. In order to make her holy, by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word, so as to present the church to himself in splendor, without a spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind. Yes, so that she may be holy and without blemish. Now, this image of washing here, there's two possible background images here, and it's hard to decide because it's talking about washing of water by the Word. The Word is often associated with the gospel. So this may be using the symbolism of baptism to talk about the way that Christ gave himself for the church in order to cleanse the church, to make the church morally pure, holy. That Christ's actions, his sacrifice, were aimed for the benefit of the church, so that the church might become what God has created the church to be. The other possibility is that this could refer to washing before marriage. It was pretty common in ancient times for people to bathe before they were married. Seemed like a good idea, right? But it's kind of weird if you apply it in this case because the imagery seems to be of the groom washing the wife, which seems inappropriate before marriage. But if that's the case, it could be recalling the story in Ezekiel 16, in which this analogy of God's relationship with Israel is pictured as the relationship of a husband and a wife, and in which God cleans Israel, but then Israel falls into sin and is judged. If that's the parallel, what's interesting is that Paul is taking it in a different direction, and he's saying the church was sinful, but now Jesus is cleansing the church so that in the end the church might be holy. But one of the things that we might not pick up here is that the way that Christ is described as doing this would have sort of shocked cultural sensibilities. The image of washing and making something without spot or wrinkle, it evokes what would have been commonly in that time and place the work done by women to wash and to launder clothes and this sort of thing. And here Christ is pictured as doing this sort of thing for the church. Once again, notice the goal is for the church to become holy, bride prepared for her union with Christ. Paul goes on by saying, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as are members of his body. One of the things to think about here is that the way that the metaphor of head and body is being used is not to emphasize the husband exercising dominion over the wife, ruling over the wife, but rather it's being used as an example of union, the head and the body together, and then also of service, as Christ gave himself for the church. Here it's talking about nourishing, tenderly caring for. The idea is that the focus is to do the best, to bring out the best in the other person. The idea is not for the husband to have a wife who helps him be the most honorable he can in society, but rather for the husband to help the wife become who she has gloriously been created to become, so that together they might be one. One of the other things that's striking in this passage is that the husband and wife are talked about as being joined so closely that it should be as natural to care for a husband to care and look out for his wife as it is, as the saying goes, to look out for number one, right? Our natural human sinful inclination is to always want to put ourselves and our interests first. And Paul is saying that makes no sense in marriage. You have to think about the other person. He not only as part of your as one body, but he says as yourself, right? This person it's as if this is your own self. He's not denying that these are different people, but he's saying he's picking up on, as we'll see, on the image in Genesis of the two becoming one flesh. And he's saying you have to take this seriously when you think about the interests of the other person. You have to care for the other person in the same way and to the same extent that you're looking out for yourself. Again, this would have been radical in that ancient cultural context in which the whole point of the structure of the household was to elevate the husband. Not so, Paul says, in the church. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh to Christ and the church. So Paul cites Genesis 2:24 here, this famous passage about marriage from Genesis, the two becoming one flesh. And again, this reinforces his image of the unity between husband and wife. But he also goes beyond that and says something that is unprecedented. He seems to be saying that actually part of the purpose of marriage in the first place, part of the reason God gave us marriage, was that so marriage could act as a sign to point for God's intention for the church to be joined to Christ. That is, marriage is part of God's plan for creation as a signal and a witness to what he intends to do for his people. The final verse says this: "Each of you, however, should love his wife as himself, and a wife should respect her husband." This is kind of the summary verse of this passage. Again, there's the emphasis for the husband to love his wife as himself. Once again, her interest should be not below his, but be put on the same level. And this may be echoing Leviticus 19:18, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," what Jesus said is the second greatest commandment. Right? Paul may be alluding to that and saying, essentially your wife is your closest neighbor. And so you should love her as you love yourself. And a wife should respect her husband. Now, the word for respect here, interestingly, it's the same word that was used back in verse 21 when it said, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." There it's translated in this translation, reverence. Here, respect. They're both fine. They're both fine translations, but one of the point here is that they both derive from the word fear. Right? Again, it doesn't mean terror. It means at least respect and something somewhat more. Now, one of the things that's of interest to me here is that when you ask men in general and women in general, it's not 100% either way, but more often than not, women will say it's more important to be loved than respected. And more often than not, men will say it's more important to be respected. Not to say we shouldn't love and respect one another. This should go both ways, mutual love, mutual respect. But notice this focuses on what generally is most important to the other person. The husband is to give the wife what is most important to her, love. The wife is to give the husband what is most important to him, respect. Now, we might say that if you think about the alternative is what is most corrosive, most destructive of the bond of marriage. When a husband, instead of loving his wife, is cruel to her, is abusive to her, it can do great violence to a marriage. When a wife shows contempt toward her husband, when she tries to rule over and control him, that can also do great violence to a marriage. When we go back to the beginning, mutual submission, one of the things we see here in this passage is that in that culture, in the way that Paul frames this, he is emphasizing a kind of mutual submission with husband and wife. It does look, in that cultural context, a little bit different for each one. Now, some of that may be because, and I know this may be a surprise to you, but men and women are not the same. You laugh, but it is controversial, believe it or not. Or rather, as a pastor of mine who's a friend likes to say, the difference between men and women isn't just the plumbing. It's not just that we have different bodies. There's something different about men and women. And so that may be part of what Paul is getting at here, but at the same time, we have to be aware that there are also certain cultural expectations that he is interacting with. And so it's going to require discernment, asking how do we translate this into our time, into our own relationships. Some of the basic principles should be pretty clear from this, but in terms of how to do that, that's a matter of discernment, and it's a matter of discernment, note, for each one. The wife is not told, make sure your husband does this. The husband is not told, make sure your wife does this. How can you build one another up? Because that's been a major focus in Ephesians. You might think back in chapter 4 to the image of the church, the different parts of the church working together to build up the church. The same image here in marriage. Marriage is sort of a microcosm of that, in which the husband and wife are to ask, what can I do to build the other up so that we can grow together in love? Because not only is that fruitful for marriage, but it also bears witness to what God is doing in creation, to what God is doing through Christ, to what God is offering to the church. Paul calls this a great mystery, that marriage becomes a sign when it's done in a way that honors God, that reflects Christ's own sacrifice and our relationship with Him. When it's done in this way, it gets at the very heart of God's plan for what is good for us as human beings. It bears witness to the union of Christ and the church. So this passage really exalts marriage. Now, marriage isn't the only good option. Paul will talk in 1 Corinthians 7 about the value of a single life as well. But this passage is the one in the New Testament that deals with the most theological depth about marriage itself, and it's worth considering. It's a challenging passage because to our ears in modern times, oftentimes it catches us in ways that we might not be comfortable with. And we should ask ourselves how much of that is because of cultural differences, how much of that is just because we want to do our own thing. But when the emphasis is on what does it take to build up the other person, what does it take to grow together, then the unity and love that is possible, well, that points our vision heavenward. And that should make our hearts sing. So let's go to the Lord in prayer.